Doctor humiliates armless nurse, but he didn't expect what she'd do next. Jessica Thompson took a deep breath as she gazed at the imposing facade of Mount Sinai University Hospital in Boston. Her metallic fingers nervously adjusted the freshly issued ID badge hanging from her light blue uniform. Today was her first day as a nurse in the intensive care unit of the most prestigious hospital in New England. Dr. Michael Reynolds, head of the cardiothoracic surgery department, made no effort to hide his discomfort when he saw her enter the meeting room. His eyes fixed on the metal prosthetics that replaced Jessica's arms, lost in an accident when she was just 9 years old. With a smirk full of disdain, he approached, while the other professionals pretended not to notice the growing tension. "So you're the new addition to the department? Impressive how the quota system is expanding in hospitals these days," he remarked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Jessica stood tall, her serene face masking the storm of emotions his words stirred inside her. "Good morning, Dr. Reynolds. I'm Jessica Thompson, an intensive care specialist, graduated with honors from Harvard Medical School with a master's in assistive technologies applied to nursing," she replied firmly, extending her metal hand. The doctor glanced at the prosthetic without returning the gesture, turning his back as he muttered something about questionable administrative decisions. At that moment, Jessica knew exactly what she was up against. It wouldn't be the first time. The nursing director, Mrs. Eleanor, a woman with indigenous features and impeccably styled silver hair in a bun, approached with a warm smile. "Don't mind Michael. He's an excellent doctor but a terrible human being. Come, let me show you the unit and introduce you to the team." The first few hours passed with introductions, familiarizing herself with the space and learning the hospital's specific protocols. Jessica noticed the curious glances, some compassionate, others skeptical. She was used to it. Ever since she decided to pursue nursing, her journey had been marked by those who doubted her abilities. Before her first shift was even over, an emergency was announced. A 67-year-old patient showed signs of cardiac tamponade, a potentially fatal condition where fluid builds around the heart, preventing it from functioning properly. Dr. Reynolds rushed in, followed by two visibly nervous residents. "We need an immediate pericardiocentesis," he declared, scanning the room. "Where's Nurse Ashley?" "On medical leave, doctor," replied a nursing technician. "But Jessica specializes in emergency cardiac procedures." The doctor shot Jessica a disbelieving look. "You? You're going to hold the needle with those hands?" he asked, nearly spitting the words. Without hesitation, Jessica was already preparing the pericardiocentesis kit. "I've assisted in over 30 similar procedures, doctor. My prosthetics are specifically adapted for precision in emergency invasive procedures." The patient's condition was rapidly deteriorating. The heart monitor blared urgent alerts. There was no time for debate. With visible reluctance, the doctor allowed Jessica to assist. What followed left even the most skeptical in the room in awe. With precise movements, Jessica prepped the sterile field, organized the instruments, and assisted the doctor with an efficiency few seasoned nurses could match. Her prosthetics, controlled by advanced neuromuscular impulses, executed millimeter-perfect adjustments. When the procedure ended successfully, relief was visible on everyone's faces, except Dr. Michael Reynolds. The doctor removed his gloves with a sharp motion and left without uttering a single word of thanks to the nurse. "He's going to need more than that to admit he was wrong," remarked one of the residents, a young man named Ryan, who had watched Jessica's skill in awe. "I'm not here to prove anything to Dr. Reynolds," she replied, methodically organizing the materials she had used. "I'm here for the patients." But both knew that wasn't entirely true. In a world that constantly questioned her ability, every successful procedure was a silent declaration, "I belong here." In the weeks that followed, Jessica settled into a routine at the hospital. She always arrived an hour before her official shift began, reviewed her patients' charts, and meticulously prepared for each scheduled procedure. Her dedication quickly earned the respect of the other nurses and much of the medical staff. Everyone, that is, except Michael Reynolds. The doctor seemed to have made it his personal mission to prove the incompetence he believed was inevitable. He assigned Jessica the most complex cases, eagerly awaiting the moment she would fail. He demanded detailed reports he never asked of any other nurse. He publicly questioned her decisions, even when they were impeccably grounded in protocol. One particularly busy morning, Jessica was assigned to care for old George, a 78-year-old patient who had been admitted after a heart attack. The elderly man, already in his third week of hospitalization, was known for his difficult temper and constant refusal of treatment. "If you can get him to take his meds without causing a scene, consider yourself promoted," joked Ashley, who had returned from her leave and quickly formed a friendship with Jessica. The newcomer smiled and headed to old George's room. When she entered, she found the elderly man sitting on the edge of the bed, legs dangling, trying to stand up. "Good morning, Mr. George. What are you doing?" she asked gently, approaching him. The old man turned sharply, ready to snap back with his usual hostility, but his words died in his throat when he saw Jessica's prosthetics. His eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, widened in surprise. "What happened to your arms, girl?" he asked with the bluntness only the very young or the very old allow themselves. Jessica smiled serenely, accustomed to the question. "Lost them. In an accident when I was little. But I got these in return," she replied, deftly moving her metal fingers. "They're like superpowers. I can do almost anything anyone else can, and some things even better." Genuine curiosity replaced the usual irritation on the old man's face. "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore. It's been so long sometimes I forget they're not my original arms." An immediate connection formed between them. Old George, who had lost some mobility in his right leg after a stroke years earlier, found in Jessica not the pity he so despised, but a genuine understanding of the challenges of adapting to new physical limitations. That morning, for the first time in weeks, old George took all his medications without protest. He agreed to do his breathing exercises and even allowed the full bath he had been refusing. When Dr. Reynolds made his rounds, he was visibly surprised to find the patient cooperative and in good spirits. Old George, never one to mince words, addressed the doctor. "This girl's an angel, Doc. I want only her taking care of me from now on." Michael adjusted his stethoscope around his neck, visibly annoyed. "We'll see what's possible, Mr. George. Nurse Thompson has many other patients under her care." "Then get more people like her. Those metal hands work miracles," the old man exclaimed with a raspy laugh. Jessica noticed how the doctor tensed at the comment, but maintained his professionalism, silently grateful for the patient's trust. As she left the room, Michael stopped Jessica in the hallway. "I don't know what kind of trick you used on him, but stick to the protocols. No miracle promises or alternative treatments," he warned in a low voice. "No tricks, doctor. Just empathy." "Something you don't learn in medical books," she replied, gripping her clipboard firmly with her prosthetics. A quiet reminder of her resilience. Days turned into weeks, and Jessica's presence on the team became increasingly indispensable. Patients asked for her, requested her specific care. Her ability to handle difficult cases, especially elderly patients resistant to treatment, became well known throughout the hospital. Old George's son, William, an influential real estate businessman in Boston, was so impressed by his father's progress under Jessica's care that he requested a meeting with the hospital administration. "I want to express my gratitude for Nurse Thompson," he declared during the meeting, attended by the administrative director, the head of nursing, and, at his own insistence, Dr. Michael Reynolds. "In 2 weeks, she achieved more progress with my father's treatment than in the previous 2 months. I'm considering a substantial donation to the hospital's rehabilitation program, specifically for assistive technology research." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The meeting ended with smiles and handshakes, but his unease was palpable. That same afternoon, he summoned Jessica to his office. The nurse entered with the impeccable posture that defined her, prepared for another round of veiled criticism. "Miss Thompson, I understand you're eager to prove your worth," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But I must remind you, this is a university hospital, not a talent show." Jessica remained silent, letting him continue his monologue. "I've observed your interactions with patients, and while I recognize a certain communicative skill, I'm still concerned about safety in more complex procedures," he went on, avoiding direct eye contact. "Some procedures require tactile sensitivity that, well," his eyes finally settled on her prosthetics, "simply can't be replicated artificially." Something in his condescending tone ignited a courage in Jessica she didn't know she had. She was tired of proving herself daily, of having her competence constantly questioned. "Dr. Reynolds, with all due respect, if you have specific concerns about my technical ability, I propose a challenge," she declared, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Give me a week. Assign me the cases you see fit. Observe my performance, without interference. If after that time you still believe I pose any risk to patient safety, I'll request a transfer voluntarily." Michael raised his eyebrows, surprised by the proposal. A slow, calculated smile formed on his lips. This was the perfect opportunity to expose the limitations he was certain existed. "I accept your proposal, Miss Thompson. In fact, I think it'll be an educational experiment for the entire team," he replied, extending his hand in a gesture that in any other context would have seemed cordial. Jessica shook his offered hand with her prosthetic, feeling his momentary hesitation at the touch of metal. The pact was sealed. What Jessica didn't realize was that this week would only be the beginning of a much larger battle. A battle that would test not only her technical skills, but also her emotional strength and her determination to forever change the perception of people with disabilities in the medical field. The next morning, Michael handed Jessica a patient list that would challenge even the most experienced nurse. It included complex post-operative cases, patients with multiple comorbidities, and situations requiring quick, precise interventions. "Your week starts now, Miss Thompson," he announced with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jessica scanned the list without showing surprise or hesitation. She had expected something like this. "Thank you for the opportunity, Doctor. I'll start right away with Mr. Johnson in room 507. The first 48 hours were exhausting. Jessica barely left the hospital, using quiet moments to rest briefly in the nurse's lounge. Each patient required specific attention. Each procedure demanded absolute focus. There was no room for error. The nursing staff, sensing what was happening, discreetly rearranged their schedules to offer extra support to their colleague. Ashley arrived earlier. Kevin stayed later. Sarah helped with documentation. It was a silent network of solidarity that Michael, in his arrogance, failed to notice. On the third day, the first emergency struck. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now back to the story. Mr. Johnson, a 62-year-old patient recovering from heart surgery, suddenly showed signs of plummeting blood pressure and internal bleeding. Jessica was alone in the room during a routine check when she noticed the first symptoms. Without wasting a second, she called a code and began stabilizing the patient. Her metallic hands worked with impressive precision, inserting a large bore IV for rapid fluid replacement. Dr. Reynolds arrived minutes later with 2 residents. He found the patient already stabilized, with Jessica closely monitoring vitals while administering emergency medication. "What happened?" he demanded, striding to the bedside. "Suspected post-op bleeding, doctor. BP dropped to 80/40. Heart rate spiked to 120. I gave a 500 ml saline bolus, started norepinephrine per protocol, and requested packed RBCs. Labs are already drawn," Jessica reported succinctly, her eyes fixed on the monitor. Michael checked the patient, reviewed the chart, and verified the meds. Everything followed protocol perfectly. He had no criticism to offer. "Good work," he muttered reluctantly. "We'll take him for a CT, then likely back to the OR." It was the first time he'd spoken words of approval to the nurse. Jessica simply nodded, continuing to prep the patient for transport. That incident could have been a turning point, a moment of recognition, but to Michael it was just a statistical anomaly. He was convinced it was only a matter of time before Jessica's physical limitations became undeniable. The opportunity he'd been waiting for came on the 5th day, during a complex abdominal wound dressing change, a procedure requiring strict aseptic technique and delicate tissue handling. the kind of task Michael believed impossible to perform adequately with prosthetics. He entered the procedure room unannounced, flanked by 3 residents, a perfect audience for what he expected to be the definitive proof of Jessica's limitations. She watched silently as she prepared the sterile field and organized the materials. "Miss Thompson, don't you think it would be more appropriate to ask for assistance with this procedure?" he asked with feigned concern. "It's a particularly complex dressing." "I appreciate the concern, Dr. Reynolds, but I have extensive experience with this type of procedure," Jessica replied calmly while donning the sterile gloves with the adapted technique she had developed over the years. The doctor crossed his arms and positioned himself strategically to observe her every move. The residents, sensing the tension in the air, exchanged uneasy glances. Jessica proceeded with the procedure, demonstrating extraordinary precision. Her prosthetics, equipped with pressure sensors at the fingertips, allowed her to handle the tissue with surprising delicacy. The removal of the old dressing, the cleaning of the wound, the application of the new dressing, each step was executed with technical perfection. When she finished, Michael waited for the residents to leave before approaching. "Impressive demonstration, Miss Thompson," he remarked with a tight smile, "but I wonder if that precision would hold up in less controlled situations." "That's what we train for, Dr. Reynolds, to maintain precision regardless of the circumstances," she replied, properly disposing of the used materials. "We'll see," was all he said before walking away. That same afternoon, an emergency arose in the cardiology wing. A patient in cardiac arrest required immediate action. The resuscitation team was called, and Jessica, as part of the rotation, responded promptly. When she arrived, she found Michael already initiating resuscitation maneuvers. The doctor shot her a look that mixed challenge and skepticism. "Miss Thompson, take over compressions," he ordered, stepping aside to let her position herself. It was a critical situation. Chest compressions required precise force and a steady rhythm, 100 to 120 compressions per minute, 5 to 6 centimeters deep. Any variation could compromise the effectiveness of the resuscitation. Jessica took her position without hesitation. Her prosthetics, designed with advanced force control systems, allowed her to apply exactly the necessary pressure. The capnography monitor, which assessed the effectiveness of the compressions, showed ideal values, confirming her flawless technique. After 20 minutes of coordinated efforts, the patient regained a spontaneous heartbeat. The team breathed, a sigh of relief, and Michael, despite his reluctance, couldn't ignore Jessica's crucial contribution to the successful resuscitation. "The compressions were adequate," he admitted, while overseeing the patient's transfer to the ICU. By the end of the 6th day, Jessica's reputation was firmly established among the team. Her technical competence, combined with extraordinary empathy for patients, made her stand out even among the most experienced professionals. Mrs. Eleanor, the nursing director, called her for a private conversation. "I'm impressed, Jessica, not just by your technical skills, which we already knew, but by your resilience in the face of difficulties," she remarked, carefully choosing her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor. I'm just doing my job. We know it's more than that. Dr. Reynolds has been challenging, to say the least. I can step in if you'd like." Jessica smiled, gently adjusting the clip holding her badge with her metal fingers. "I appreciate the concern, but I'd rather finish what I started. It's important that this change comes from him, not from outside intervention." The director nodded, respecting her decision, but worried about the emotional toll this silent battle might be taking. On the 7th and final day of the challenge, Michael decided to present the ultimate test. He assigned Jessica to assist directly in a complex surgery, a triple coronary bypass on a high-risk patient. It was a procedure that would typically require a scrub nurse with years of specific experience, not someone from the support staff. "Miss Thompson, you'll assist in Mr. Johnson's surgery tomorrow," he announced during the shift handover. "I hope you're familiar with cardiac surgery instruments." Silence fell over the room. Everyone knew the assignment was irregular, disproportionate, and clearly meant to set her up for failure. It was the final trap. Jessica kept her composure, aware of her colleagues' worried glances. "I'll be prepared, Dr. Reynolds," she replied simply. That night, after her shift, Jessica didn't go home. She went to the hospital's medical library and spent hours studying the surgery's specific protocols, reviewing the placement of each instrument, anticipating every step of the procedure. When the library closed, she continued her studies in the nursing lounge, using her tablet to watch educational videos on cardiac surgery instrumentation. Ashley found her asleep on a pile of scientific papers at 5 a.m. "Jessica, did you stay here all night?" she asked worriedly, gently touching her shoulder. The nurse startled awake, momentarily disoriented. "What time is it?" "5 in the morning. The surgery's at 7, right? You need some real rest." Jessica rubbed her eyes with the backs of her metallic hands, a surprisingly delicate gesture. "I'm fine. Just need a strong coffee and a quick shower. I have a clean change of clothes in my locker, and the shower in the changing room is working." "I'll bring you coffee while you get ready," Ashley offered, genuinely concerned for her colleague. By 6:45 a.m., Jessica was in the operating room, impeccably prepared. She had mentally rehearsed every step of the procedure dozens of times. Her prosthetics gleamed under the bright lights, freshly sanitized with the special antimicrobial solution she always carried. Michael arrived promptly at 7, surprised to find her already gowned and familiarizing herself with the room's setup. "I see you're eager to begin, Miss Thompson," he remarked with mild irony. "Just prepared, Doctor," she replied calmly. The surgery, expected to last about 4 hours, stretched to 6. Unexpected complications arose when the patient developed persistent arrhythmia during the procedure. The tension in the room was palpable. At every critical moment, Jessica anticipated the surgeon's needs, positioning instruments precisely, adapting to changes with impressive flexibility. Her prosthetics, far from being a limitation, provided exceptional stability in handling delicate surgical tools. At the most critical point, when sudden bleeding threatened the surgery's success, it was Jessica who reacted with exemplary readiness, providing exactly the right materials and assisting in controlling the hemorrhage before even being asked. Michael, focused on the surgical field, had no choice but to work in perfect sync with her. It was a silent, precise dance where every move had life or death consequences. When the surgery finally ended successfully, exhaustion was evident on every face. The team began dispersing, while Jessica methodically organized the used materials, strictly following disposal and sterilization protocols. Michael remained in the room, watching her silently. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, stripped of its usual arrogance. "You exceeded expectations today, Miss Thompson." Jessica didn't respond immediately, finishing organizing her materials before turning to face him. "I didn't exceed my own expectations, Dr. Reynolds. I just did what I know how to do." The doctor nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement that there was something to be learned here. It wasn't just about Jessica's technical ability. It was about the biases he carried, the limitations he had projected onto her that, in reality, existed only in his own perception. "Our week of evaluation is over," he declared, removing his surgical cap. "I consider the test satisfactorily completed." "Does that mean I can stay in the department?" Jessica asked directly. "It means you've earned your place here," he replied, extending his hand in a gesture that this time held genuine respect. Jessica accepted the handshake, her prosthetics firmly gripping the doctor's hand. It was only the beginning of a long journey, she knew. One doctor had changed his perception, but the world outside was still full of Michael Reynolds, people who looked at her prosthetics and saw only limitations. As she left the operating room that night, Jessica had no idea that a series of unexpected events was about to turn her personal experience into a revolution in inclusion protocols at Mount Sinai University Hospital. That her individual battle would become a collective one, that her metallic hands would change lives in ways she had never dreamed possible. Walking down the quiet hallway, exhausted but fulfilled, she couldn't have predicted that the real challenge and the real transformation was still to come. In the weeks that followed, Jessica noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere at Mount Sinai. The looks no longer carried the same suspicion. Instead, there was a new kind of admiration, especially among the younger residents who had witnessed her work in cardiac surgery. Still, she knew professional recognition was like building a house, brick by brick, day after day, patient after patient. What she hadn't anticipated was that Dr. Michael Reynolds, after that brief moment of acknowledgement, would develop an even subtler form of resistance. He could no longer openly question her technical competence. The results spoke for themselves. But he found other ways to make her journey harder. One particularly busy morning, Jessica noticed changes in the medication schedules for 2 of her patients. The notes in her impeccable handwriting had been discreetly altered, with times and dosages slightly adjusted. "Strange," she murmured, to herself, comparing the charts with her personal notes. "Is something wrong?" asked Sarah, a newly hired nursing technician who looked at Jessica with barely concealed admiration. "Probably just a transcription error," Jessica replied with a reassuring smile, not wanting to alarm her colleague. But inside, an alarm went off. That afternoon, during the shift handover, Michael made an apparently casual remark. "I noticed some inconsistencies in the medication records for 507 and 512. We need to emphasize the importance of accuracy, especially with high-complexity patients." His eyes briefly locked onto Jessica, and she immediately understood the subtext. It wasn't an innocent comment, it was a veiled accusation. "I'll personally review the records, Dr. Reynolds," she replied calmly, holding his gaze. From that day on, Jessica implemented a new routine. She arrived 30 minutes early and meticulously checked every record before starting her shift. She kept digital photos of all her notes on her personal phone as a safeguard. Every discrepancy she found, she simply corrected and documented, without confrontation, without accusations. It was a silent and exhausting game, but she was determined not to give in. Patients kept requesting her care specifically. Old George, now in the final stage of recovery, had become her biggest advocate, telling every visitor about the nurse with magic hands who had transformed his hospital experience. "You know what I like most about you, girl?" he asked one afternoon as Jessica checked his vitals. "It's that you never treated me like a useless old man. From day one, you talked to me like I was still a person." Jessica smiled, adjusting the blood pressure cuff with the precise movements of her prosthetics. "You've always been and always will be a person, old George. One of the most interesting ones I've met, in fact." The elderly man chuckled, but soon his expression turned serious. "That doctor, Dr. Reynolds, he doesn't like you, does he?" The question caught Jessica off guard. Old George's sharp perception sometimes unsettled her. "Dr. Reynolds is an excellent professional," she replied diplomatically. "We just have different views on some things, that's all." "Nonsense," old George muttered. "He looks at you the way my father looked at the factory workers, like they were tools, not people." That observation lingered in Jessica's mind for the rest of the day. Maybe that was exactly it. To Michael, she would never be a colleague, an equal. She would always be the nurse with prosthetics, an anomaly to be tolerated, not a professional to be respected. The situation reached a new level 2 weeks later, during a dressing change for a patient with extensive burns. Dr. Reynolds entered the room without warning, accompanied by 3 residents, just as Jessica was midway through the procedure with the sterile field perfectly set up. "Miss Thompson, I believe there's contamination in your field," he declared, pointing to her prosthetics. "The metal joints can harbor bacteria even with gloves. I'll take over the procedure." The accusation, made in front of the residents and the patient himself, was professionally devastating. Jessica felt her face flush, but she kept her composure. "Dr. Reynolds, I use a special sterilization protocol for my prosthetics, approved by the Hospital Infection Control Committee. There's no risk of contamination," she replied firmly. "It's a risk we can't take," he insisted, gesturing for her to step aside. "Better safe than sorry." Jessica had no choice but to retreat, acutely aware of the residents' curious glances and the patient's confused expression. That public humiliation was calculated to undermine her credibility, to reinforce the idea that, in the end, her prosthetics were an insurmountable obstacle. Back in the nurses' station, Jessica felt a rage she rarely allowed herself to experience. Her metal hands trembled slightly as she tried to type up the incident report. That's when she noticed Emma, one of the residents who had witnessed the scene, standing in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. "He's wrong, you know," the young doctor said, stepping in and closing the door behind her. "I recently studied an article on sterilization protocols for professionals with prosthetics. If your prosthetics are regularly treated with the proper antimicrobial agents, the contamination risk is statistically insignificant." Jessica looked at the resident in surprise. She hadn't expected an act of solidarity from the medical team, especially not from someone directly under Michael's supervision. "Thank you for saying that," she replied sincerely. "Sometimes it's hard not to doubt myself when people like Dr. Reynolds use authority to validate prejudice." Emma finished with an understanding smile. "I know that story all too well." Something in the way the resident said those words suggested to Jessica that she too carried her own battles. "He has a lot to teach clinically," Emma continued, "but as a human being, he leaves much to be desired." That small moment of solidarity renewed Jessica's strength. She wasn't alone in that fight after all. That night, determined not to let Michael's accusation go unanswered, Jessica spent hours researching the latest studies on sterilization protocols for healthcare professionals with prosthetics. She found articles published in respected medical journals, guidelines from the American Association of Nursing, and even international cases similar to hers. The next morning, she prepared a complete dossier and sent it not only to Michael, but also to the nursing director, the head of hospital infection control, and the clinical director. The email was respectful but direct. "In response to the concerns raised about the safety of my procedures, I am forwarding up-to-date scientific material that supports the protocols I rigorously follow. I am available to discuss any improvements or adaptations that could further enhance our patients' safety." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. The response came in the form of an official memo from the Hospital Infection Control Committee, acknowledging the appropriateness of Jessica's procedures and suggesting that her protocol be formalized as a guideline for future professionals in similar situations. It was a small but significant victory. The look on Michael's face when he received the memo, a mix of surprise and restrained irritation, was a moment Jessica would cherish. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic between them shifted subtly. The attempts at sabotage continued, but in increasingly discreet ways. Michael seemed to have realized that direct attacks were ineffective. Now he opted for subtler strategies, like constantly changing Jessica's schedule, assigning her the most difficult patients, and demanding detailed reports no other nurse had to produce. Emma, the resident who had grown closer to Jessica, began quietly documenting these episodes. As a young doctor, she knew the risk she was taking by opposing a superior like Michael, but something in her conscience wouldn't let her remain indifferent. "I'm keeping a record," she confided to Jessica during a break. "I don't know if it'll ever be needed, but it's important to have it documented." Jessica hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea. "I don't want to start a war in the department, Emma. I just want to do my job." "Sometimes to do what's right, you have to fight," the resident replied with a conviction that seemed to come from personal experience. "And don't worry, I'll be discreet." August brought a new challenge to Mount Sinai University Hospital, the opening of a new pediatric wing specializing in children with physical disabilities. The project was a point of pride for the administration, which promised an inclusive and innovative approach. During a general meeting, the clinical director announced the team that would oversee the new wing. "It is with great pleasure that I announce Dr. Michael Reynolds as the medical director of the new inclusive pediatric wing," he declared, met with polite applause from the staff. Jessica felt a tightness in her chest. The irony was almost painful. The very doctor who had shown the most resistance to including a professional with a disability would now be responsible for a wing dedicated to children with physical disabilities. But the bigger surprise was yet to come, and at the request of Doctor himself. Mendez, nurse Jessica Thompson, will serve as head nurse of the new unit, bringing not only her technical expertise but also her valuable personal experience to The care of these children. A stunned silence preceded the applause. Jessica, completely taken by surprise, searched for Michael's face in the crowd. He maintained a neutral, professional expression, but his eyes told another story when they briefly met hers. It wasn't a gesture of reconciliation or acknowledgement, it was strategic. By placing her in the new wing, directly under his supervision, he ensured even greater control over her work. And at the same time, he crafted for himself an image of an inclusive mentor, willing to work side by side with a professional with disabilities. The brilliance of the move was undeniable and deeply unsettling. "Congratulations on the promotion," Ashley told her after the meeting, genuinely happy for her friend. "You deserve it." "Thank you," Jessica replied automatically, her mind still processing the implications of the announcement. "You don't seem very excited," her friend observed, furrowing her brow. "I'm just surprised. Dr. Reynolds has never shown interest in working directly with me before." Ashley shrugged. "Maybe he's finally recognized your worth. People can change, you know." Jessica nodded without conviction. Her experience told her such radical transformations were rarely genuine. There was more to this story. Her suspicions were partially confirmed at the first planning meeting for the new wing 2 days later. Michael presented an aggressive timeline and operational guidelines that, while technically excellent, would require near superhuman effort from the nursing staff. "Any questions?" he asked at the end of the presentation, his gaze briefly settling on Jessica. "The protocols seem excellent, Dr. Reynolds," she replied calmly. "But the proposed nursing staff allocation is insufficient for the projected workload. We'll need at least 2 more nurses and 4 more technicians to maintain these quality standards." The doctor smiled slightly, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand your concern, Nurse Thompson, but the budget was approved. Based on the current team, I'm sure with your usual creativity, you'll find ways to optimize available resources." The message was clear. You wanted the challenge, now deal with it, under impossible conditions. In the weeks leading up to the new wing's opening, Jessica worked tirelessly. She developed time optimization spreadsheets, redesigned workflows, and created mutual support systems among the teams. Her nights and weekends vanished, consumed by the effort to make the impossible feasible. During this time, Michael remained strangely distant. He appeared only at formal meetings, made his always clinically precise remarks, and withdrew. It was as if he was waiting for the inevitable failure, ready to step in at the exact moment he could prove to everyone that entrusting such a major responsibility to someone with limitations like Jessica had been a mistake. 3 days before the official opening, an incident completely changed the course of events. Michael had scheduled a delicate surgery for an 11-year-old boy with a congenital malformation. The procedure was technically complex, with narrow margins for error. During the prep, with the patient already anesthetized, the doctor seemed oddly tense and distracted. Jessica, assisting in the surgery because the case would be transferred to the new wing post-recovery, noticed when he requested a medication dosage that didn't match the protocol for that type of procedure. "Dr. Reynolds, do you confirm the dosage of 0.5 mg?" she asked discreetly, giving him the chance to correct what she assumed was a slip. The doctor glared irritably over his surgical mask. "That's exactly what I ordered, nurse." Jessica hesitated. The correct dosage should be 0.05 mg, 1/10 of what he had requested. The difference could have serious consequences for the young patient. "Sir, the pediatric protocol indicates 0.05 mg for this procedure," she insisted, keeping her tone respectful but firm. A tense silence filled the room. The other team members exchanged uneasy glances. Michael seemed to finally realize his mistake. For a moment, a flicker of vulnerability crossed his eyes, quickly replaced by a closed expression. "Naturally, that's what I meant. 0.05 mg," he corrected curtly, without thanking her or acknowledging the potential error that had been avoided. The rest of the surgery proceeded under palpable tension. When the procedure ended successfully, Michael left quickly, without his usual remarks to the team. Jessica stayed behind to complete the documentation and ensure the patient's safe transfer to the recovery room. That's when Emma approached. her expression grave. "You saved that boy today," she whispered, "and he'll never even—" "No. It was just a misunderstanding," Jessica replied diplomatically. "We all make mistakes." Emma shook her head, unconvinced. "The difference is, when we make mistakes, he's the first to point them out. But when he does, it's just a misunderstanding." Jessica didn't respond. There was nothing to say. What she didn't expect was Michael's reaction the next day. During the morning meeting, with the entire team present, the doctor spoke with a dark expression. "I need to address an incident that occurred yesterday," he began, his tone serious. "During Christopher Davis's surgery, Nurse Thompson inappropriately questioned my medical judgment, creating an atmosphere of distrust in the operating room. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Jessica felt her blood run cold. I understand Nurse Thompson's eagerness to demonstrate her knowledge, but there are protocols to follow. Medical decisions should be questioned privately, not by exposing the physician in front of the team and potentially creating an unsafe environment." The accusation was so absurd that for a moment, Jessica was speechless. She had, with all possible discretion, prevented a dosage error that could have had serious consequences, and now she was being publicly accused of insubordination? Before she could formulate a response, Emma stood, her face flushed with indignation. "With all due respect, Dr. Reynolds, that's not what happened. Nurse Thompson correctly identified a potentially dangerous dosage error and addressed it in a completely professional and discreet manner. If not for her intervention, we might be discussing a serious adverse event this morning." The silence that followed was deafening. Never in the recent history of Mount Sinai University Hospital had a resident so directly contradicted a senior physician in a team meeting. Michael's face turned purple, his jaw clenched under rigid control. "Dr. Wilson, your inexperience may prevent you from fully understanding the dynamics of an operating room," he finally replied, his voice dangerously controlled. "I suggest you observe more and speak less until you gain the necessary professional maturity." Emma didn't back down. "My inexperience doesn't stop me from recognizing when a mistake is made and when a professional acts correctly to protect a patient," she countered, her voice trembling but determined. "And I have records documenting a pattern of behavior toward Nurse Thompson that—" "Enough," Michael interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. "This meeting is over. Doctor Wilson, I expect to see you in my office in 15 minutes. With that, he stood up and left the room, leaving behind a stunned silence. Jessica immediately sought out Emma, worried about the consequences the young doctor would face. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly, genuinely concerned. "He could harm your residency, your career." Emma smiled, a mix of nervousness and determination. "Some things are more important than a career. Integrity is one of them. Even so, I don't want you to suffer because of me. It's not because of you, Jessica. It's about what's right." As Emma headed to Dr. Reynolds' office for what would surely be a severe reprimand, Jessica felt overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Gratitude for the young doctor's courage, guilt over the consequences she would face, and a growing anger at the system that allowed doctors like Dr. Reynolds to use their power to intimidate and manipulate. The rest of the day passed in a tense atmosphere. No one directly mentioned the incident from the meeting, but it was as if a heavy cloud hung over the entire team. Emma didn't return to her usual duties, and rumors circulated that she had been temporarily removed from the surgical team. At the end of her shift, physically and emotionally exhausted, Jessica found Mrs. Eleanor waiting for her in the locker room. "We need to talk," said the nursing director, her usually calm face marked with worry. They sat in a more secluded corner, and the older woman took a deep breath before speaking. "Dr. Reynolds has formally requested your transfer from the new pediatric wing, even before its official opening." Jessica nodded slowly. She had expected something like this. "What was the official reason?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Incompatibility with the team's philosophy," replied Mrs. Eleanor, disapproval clear in her tone. A vague enough justification to avoid easy challenge. "I understand." "No, you don't, Jessica." The director leaned forward, her voice now almost a whisper. "This isn't just about you or Dr. Reynolds. It's about a system that lets power and prejudice decide who belongs and who doesn't, who gets a voice and who must stay silent." Jessica looked at the older woman in surprise. She had never heard her speak so openly. "What are you suggesting, Mrs. Eleanor?" "I'm suggesting it might be time to stop quietly accepting injustice." Dr. Wilson presented the clinical director today with extensive documentation about Dr. Reynolds' behavior toward you over the past few months. Records, testimonies, documented incidents. Jessica felt a lump in her throat. So Emma had indeed kept that record and now, risking her own career, had officially submitted it. "She shouldn't have done that," she murmured, feeling a mix of gratitude and apprehension. Maybe not, but she did. And now the hospital administration can no longer pretend ignorance. An emergency board meeting has been called for tomorrow. You'll be asked to share your side of the story. That night, Jessica barely slept. She mentally revisited every incident, every provocation, every moment of veiled or explicit humiliation she had endured over the past few months. She questioned whether she should really take things further. It would be easier to just accept the transfer, start fresh in another department far from Dr. Reynolds. But then she thought of the children in the new pediatric wing, children with physical disabilities like hers, children who would need not just excellent medical care, but also living proof that their limitations wouldn't define their future, that doctors like Dr. Reynolds, who saw only what they lacked, wouldn't have the final say in their lives. That was when she made her decision. She wouldn't fight just for herself, but for all who would come after her. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning in the administrative boardroom. When Jessica arrived precisely at 9:55, she found a setup that looked more like a courtroom. On one side, Michael Reynolds with the hospital's lawyer. On the other, 3 empty chairs, apparently meant for her and anyone accompanying her. In the center sat the administrative director, the clinical director, the head of nursing, and 2 board members she didn't immediately recognize. "Good morning, Miss Thompson," the administrative director greeted formally. "Please take your seat. We're just waiting for Dr. Wilson to begin." Michael kept his eyes fixed on his papers, deliberately avoiding her gaze. The atmosphere was one of tense formality. Emma arrived minutes later, accompanied by a middle-aged woman with an elegant bearing and a determined expression. "I apologize for the delay," the stranger said. "Boston traffic remains a challenge. I'm Dr. Margaret Harris, a specialist in health law and a representative of the American Association of Healthcare Professionals with Disabilities." A surprised murmur rippled through the room. Jessica glanced at Emma, who gave her a small, encouraging smile. "We weren't informed about external legal representation," the hospital's lawyer remarked, clearly uncomfortable. "Miss Thompson is fully entitled to specialized counsel, given the nature of this meeting," Dr. Harris replied calmly, taking a seat beside Jessica. "Though I'm here more as an observer and consultant than as a formal legal representative." The administrative director cleared his throat, regaining control of the situation. "Let's get straight to the point. We're here to discuss allegations of systematic discrimination against nurse Jessica Thompson by Dr. Michael Reynolds, as well as a possible incident of retaliation involving Dr. Emma Wilson. Dr. Reynolds, since the accusation stems initially from documentation submitted by Dr. Wilson, I'd like to hear your version of events first." Michael adjusted in his seat, his expression unreadable. "With all due respect, sir, I see this situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding amplified by inexperience and personal ambitions," he began, his voice controlled and professional. "Since Miss Thompson joined our team, I've made every effort to integrate her properly, taking into account her specific circumstances." Jessica felt her metal fingers tighten involuntarily. The thinly veiled condescension in every word was almost palpable. "Naturally, there are unique challenges when working with professionals who have special needs," he continued. "My role as department head includes ensuring these challenges don't compromise patient safety or care. If at any point my legitimate concerns were interpreted as discrimination, I deeply regret it." His performance was impeccable, polite, reasonable, professional. If Jessica hadn't lived through every moment of humiliation and sabotage, even she might have been convinced. As for Miss Thompson's transfer request from the new pediatric wing, he went on, it was a decision based purely on technical considerations. The wing will require specific procedures that may be extraordinarily challenging for someone with Miss Thompson's physical limitations. Dr. Harris made a note on her pad, her face remaining neutral, but her eyes sharp with understanding of the strategy at play. Dr. Reynolds, the clinical director, interjected, consulting his notes. Could you clarify why then you specifically requested Miss Thompson for the head nurse position of this same wing just 2 weeks ago? Michael hesitated for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. An integration attempt that, unfortunately, proved unfeasible after a more thorough analysis of the technical requirements for the position. I see, replied the director, not revealing whether he accepted the explanation or not. Dr. Wilson, I'd now like to hear what prompted your documentation and formal complaint. Emma straightened in her chair, visibly nervous but determined. In the 3 months I've worked directly with Dr. Reynolds and Nurse Thompson, I've observed a consistent pattern of behavior that, in my professional and ethical judgment, constitutes workplace harassment and disability-based discrimination, she began, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. I've exhaustively documented these incidents, including dates, times, witnesses, and specific contexts. She then detailed several episodes, the alterations in medication records, the disproportionate task assignments, the veiled public humiliations, culminating in the surgery incident and the subsequent retaliation. What's most concerning beyond the individual acts is the systematic pattern, she concluded. A pattern that creates a hostile work environment, not just for Nurse Thompson, but for any professional who doesn't fit Dr. Reynolds' idea of the standard model. When Emma finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Michael wore a carefully crafted look of disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend how his actions had been so misrepresented. Ms. Thompson, the administrative director finally said, turning to Jessica, I'd like to hear your perspective. Jessica took a deep breath. All night she had mentally rehearsed what she would say at this moment. She had considered detailing every discriminatory action, expressing her outrage, demanding justice. But now, sitting in that room under their watchful gazes, something different emerged. I've been at Mount Sinai University Hospital for exactly 3 months and 18 days, she began, her voice calm but firm. In that time, I've attended to 157 patients, participated in 23 surgical procedures, performed 412 high-complexity nursing procedures, and conducted 67 training sessions for technicians and assistants. She paused briefly, her eyes scanning the faces in the room. In every single one of those moments, my prosthetics have been an integral part of who I am and how I work. They're not limitations to overcome, they're extensions of my body and my professional practice. I've developed specific techniques that, in some cases, offer greater precision than biological hands. Her metal fingers moved softly over the table, a visual reminder of what was being discussed. I'm not here to accuse Dr. Reynolds or to seek any kind of revenge. I'm here because I believe Mount Sinai University Hospital has the potential to be a national example of genuine inclusion. Not the kind of inclusion that places people with disabilities in token positions to meet quotas, but the kind that recognizes diverse abilities as an asset, not a problem to work around. She then pulled a document from her folder and placed it on the table. This is a project I've been developing over the last few months, inclusive protocols for healthcare professionals with disabilities. It's not just a set of rules or accommodations, but a new work philosophy that would benefit not only professionals like me, but also our patients, especially those facing similar challenges. The clinical director picked up the document, flipping through it with genuine interest. Rather than requesting sanctions against Dr. Reynolds, Jessica continued, I propose that Mount Sinai University Hospital become a pioneer in implementing these protocols, starting precisely with the new inclusive pediatric wing. And yes, I'd like to maintain my position as head nurse of that unit, working in collaboration with the doctor, Mendez, if he's willing to make a genuine fresh start. The proposal surprised everyone, especially Michael, who for the first time looked up, staring at her with an indescribable expression. "This is unexpected," the administrative director commented after a moment of silence. "Dr. Reynolds, any remarks?" Michael seemed genuinely taken aback. He had prepared to defend himself against accusations, to counterattack, to maintain his position of authority. He wasn't prepared for this offer of collaboration after all that had happened. "I would need to review this project more carefully before taking a position," he finally replied, a neutral response that neither accepted nor rejected the proposal. Just then, the meeting room door unexpectedly opened, and a familiar figure entered leaning on a cane. Old George, accompanied by his son William, and at least a dozen other patients and family members. "Sorry for interrupting," William said, stepping forward as his father caught his breath. "But when we heard about this meeting, we felt it was essential for the patients' voices to be heard." The administrative director seemed torn between irritation at the unscheduled interruption and curiosity about what this diverse group of patients had to say. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Davis," he began, but old George raised his hand, cutting him off. "What's irregular is what you're trying to do to this young woman," the elderly man declared, pointing at Jessica with his cane. "I came here because you need to know what she's done for me and all these others." One by one, the patients began sharing their stories. An elderly woman described how Jessica had been the only one patient enough to teach her to manage her own insulin despite her shaky hands. A young man told how the nurse had adapted special techniques that allowed him to learn to care for his ostomy, giving him back his independence. An emotional mother recounted how her daughter, a teenager who had lost a leg, found in Jessica not just a caregiver but a role model. The impact of those testimonies was palpable. These weren't statistics or abstract arguments. They were real lives, transformed by the presence of someone who deeply understood what it meant to adapt to a different body. When the last patient finished speaking, old George stepped forward, looking directly at Michael. "Doctor, you're an excellent physician. You saved my life with that surgery, and I'll always be grateful. But there are things you can't learn from books or surgeries. Some things you only learn by living in the body you have, whatever it may be." The old man then turned to Jessica, a warm smile lighting up his weathered face. "This young woman has something no degree can teach. She knows what it's like to rebuild a life when your body changes. And that, doctor," he turned back to Michael, "is knowledge you should value, not try to silence." A heavy emotional silence filled the room. The administrative director, visibly moved, cleared his throat before speaking. "Thank you all for your testimonies. They will be considered in our decision." After the patients left, the meeting resumed a more formal tone, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. The personal stories had humanized what had previously been discussed in terms of protocols, regulations, and hierarchies. The clinical director, after flipping through Jessica's proposal again, looked up thoughtfully. "This is remarkable work, Miss Thompson. I see here not just practical adaptations, but a true reimagining of how healthcare can be more inclusive for professionals and patients alike." "Thank you, sir," Jessica replied simply. "Dr. Mendez," the director continued, "you are one of our most brilliant surgeons, and your contributions to this hospital are invaluable. But perhaps there is a learning opportunity here that transcends traditional medicine." Michael remained silent, his face an impenetrable mask. "I have a proposal," the administrative director finally declared, "a 30-day probationary period during which Ms. Thompson retains her position in the new pediatric wing, gradually implementing her inclusive protocol project. During this same period, we would like Dr. Reynolds to actively participate in this process, offering his medical perspective while also familiarizing himself with the proposed adaptive techniques." Dr. Margaret Harris, who had remained quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke. "If I may make a suggestion, the American Association of Healthcare Professionals with Disabilities recently developed an experience simulation program. These are temporary prosthetics that allow non-disabled professionals to experience, in controlled periods, the challenges and necessary adaptations in a hospital setting." Her gaze fixed on Michael as she continued, "It would be extraordinarily educational if Dr. Reynolds considered participating in this program during the probationary period, a unique opportunity to understand, not just theoretically, but experientially, Ms. Thompson's perspective. The suggestion landed like a bombshell in the room. The hospital's lawyer immediately began whispering something in Michael's ear, who seemed frozen in his chair. "That's," he started, but was interrupted by the chief medical officer. "A fascinating idea from both a medical and educational standpoint," the director added, genuine interest gleaming in his eyes. "We could document the entire process, perhaps even develop a scientific paper on the experience." Michael found himself in an impossible position. Refusing would indirectly admit his bias. Accepting would mean submitting to an experience he clearly found deeply unsettling. His face shifted through conflicting expressions as he weighed his options. "I would need to understand the details of this program better," he finally replied, buying time. "Of course," Dr. Harris smiled. "I can send all the documentation and safety protocols later today." The meeting concluded with a promise of a final decision within 48 hours, after a full review of Jessica's project and consideration of the simulation program proposal. As she left the room, Jessica was approached by Emma. "That was incredible," the young doctor said, her eyes shining with admiration. "The way you turned what could have been a confrontation into an opportunity for growth for the entire hospital." Jessica smiled, genuinely grateful. "Thank you for your courage, Emma. Without your support, we wouldn't even be having this conversation." "Do you really think Dr. Reynolds will agree to use the simulation prosthetics?" "I don't know," Jessica answered honestly. "But regardless of his decision, something important already happened today. Voices that usually go unheard finally found a place in this hospital." What neither of them could predict was that Michael Reynolds' decision in the coming days would trigger a transformation not just at Mount Sinai University Hospital, but potentially across the entire American healthcare system. A transformation that began with a simple challenge: to literally step into someone else's prosthetics. The 48 hours following the extraordinary meeting were marked by tense silence at Mount Sinai. Jessica continued her shifts as usual, aware of the curious glances and whispers that followed her through the halls. News of the meeting, especially the patient's moving intervention, had spread quickly among the staff. Michael, on the other hand, cancelled all his non-urgent surgeries and practically isolated himself in his office. The few who saw him reported a distant expression, as if he were fighting an internal battle invisible to others. On the afternoon of the second day, Jessica was summoned to the administrative director's office. When she arrived, she found not only the director but also the chief medical officer, Mrs. Eleanor and Dr. Margaret Harris. "Come in, Miss Thompson," invited the director, gesturing to the empty chair. "We have news." Jessica's heart raced. The presence of so many authorities suggested a significant decision. She sat down, her prostheses resting gently on the arms of the chair. "Dr. Reynolds has agreed to the program," announced the director without preamble, a slight note of surprise in his voice. "He's accepted using the simulation prostheses and working directly with you to implement the Inclusive Protocols project." Jessica blinked, momentarily speechless. Of all the possibilities she had imagined, this was perhaps the least likely. "I understand your surprise," remarked Dr. Harris with a restrained smile. "It wasn't a decision he made lightly. We spent several hours discussing the program's details and its implications." "What exactly does this mean in practice?" Jessica asked, still processing the information. The chief medical officer stepped forward to explain. "For 30 days, Dr. Reynolds will use simulation prostheses during part of his workday. He'll start with short periods, only in administrative tasks and consultations, gradually increasing to more complex procedures as he adapts. You'll work together in the new pediatric wing, implementing your Inclusive Protocols project." "And he agreed voluntarily?" Jessica questioned, still skeptical. A brief silence preceded the answer. "Let's say Dr. Reynolds recognized the unique professional development opportunity this experience represents," the administrative director replied diplomatically. "And, naturally, he understood that the alternative would be facing a formal investigation into the discrimination allegations with possible consequences for his reputation and career. Jessica nodded slowly, so it wasn't entirely voluntary. But at least he had chosen the path of reconciliation rather than confrontation. "When do we start?" "On Monday," replied Mrs. Eleanor. "That will give us time to finalize preparations for the new wing and for Dr. Reynolds to receive basic training on using the prostheses." The weekend passed in a blur of preparations. Jessica meticulously reviewed her project, refining details and anticipating potential obstacles. She was nervous, not just because of the professional responsibility, but also the human dimension of the challenge. Working side by side with someone who had systematically tried to discredit her would require an emotional strength she wasn't sure she possessed. On Monday, she arrived at the hospital an hour before the scheduled start time. She wanted to ensure everything was perfectly organized for the first day. The new pediatric wing gleamed with newly installed equipment, colorful walls, and a welcoming environment specially designed for children with different types of disabilities. At exactly 8 a.m., Michael Reynolds walked through the wing's main door. Jessica, who was organizing some documents at the nursing station, almost didn't recognize him at first glance. It wasn't just the simulation prostheses attached to his arms, sophisticated devices that limited and altered natural movements, simulating different types of disabilities. It was his expression, a mix of vulnerability and determination she had never seen before on his usually confident face. "Good morning, Dr. Reynolds," she greeted, keeping her tone professional. "Good morning, Miss Thompson," he replied, his voice slightly tense. "I apologize for being a few minutes late. The prosthetics, it took me longer than expected to get dressed." It was a small admission, almost trivial, but significant. Michael Reynolds rarely apologized and never admitted to difficulties. "I completely understand," Jessica replied. "The first day is always the most challenging. I've prepared an agenda for this morning, if that works for you." She held out a folder, which he tried to take with his training prosthetics. The movement was clumsy, and the folder fell to the floor, scattering some papers. Michael's face flushed instantly. "I'm sorry, Please don't apologize," Jessica gently interrupted, bending down to gather the papers. "It's perfectly normal. It took me weeks to handle objects with precision when I got my first prosthetics." She straightened the documents and, instead of trying to hand them back, placed them on the counter, opening the folder so he could see its contents. "Maybe it would be easier if we reviewed them together," she suggested, making no fuss about the adjustment. Michael nodded silently, grateful for her discretion. His eyes scanned the proposed schedule. 9 a.m. Meeting with the nursing staff. 10 a.m. Review of the first patient's records. 11 a.m. Facility tour with the engineer in charge of accessibility modifications. 1 p.m. Lunch. 2 p.m. Workshop, living with prosthetics, daily activity simulations. 4 p.m. Weekly planning. "It seems appropriate," he remarked, still adjusting to the strange sensation of not being able to gesture naturally while speaking. "We can begin." The meeting with the nursing staff started in a tense atmosphere that gradually shifted into something more collaborative. Michael, usually dominant in such situations, found himself in an unfamiliar position, more listener than speaker. The difficulty in gesturing and handling his presentation materials forced him to rely more on his words and, surprisingly, to give more space for the team's input. During the records review, frustration became more evident. Something as simple as turning pages or taking notes turned into a significant challenge with the training prosthetics. "How do you manage to keep such detailed records?" he asked after his third failed attempt to write a legible note. "Adaptation and technology," Jessica replied, showing him a special pen she had developed for her own prosthetics. "This one has extra weight and a modified grip. It makes handwriting much easier. But I also use voice-to-text a lot for longer notes." Michael took the adapted pen, testing it with awkward movements. "It works better if you stabilize your wrist like this," Jessica demonstrated, gently adjusting the position of his arms. The casual, professional touch created an unexpected moment of connection. For a brief instant, they weren't the arrogant doctor and the marginalized nurse, just two professionals sharing knowledge. The facility tour with the engineer revealed another layer of the challenge. design elements Michael would never have. Noticed, counter heights, equipment placement, doorknob shapes suddenly became significant obstacles. "We designed all exam rooms with adjustable height tables and equipment," the engineer explained enthusiastically. "Many decisions were based on Miss Thompson's suggestions." Michael watched Jessica interact effortlessly with the environment, her prosthetics moving with a grace earned through years of adaptation. For perhaps the first time, he realized that what he saw as a limitation was simply a different way of existing in the world. The most challenging moment of the day came after lunch, during the Living with Prosthetics workshop. Under the guidance of a specialized occupational therapist, Michael was invited to perform everyday tasks, buttoning a lab coat, using basic medical instruments, preparing a simulated injection. The frustration was palpable on his face as he struggled with tasks that, until that morning, he had performed without a second thought. His fingers, limited by the simulation prosthetics, refused to cooperate with what his brain commanded. Objects slipped, precise movements became impossible, and the time needed for each activity multiplied exponentially. It was during a particularly frustrating attempt to prepare a syringe that Michael finally lost his composure. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed, knocking over the materials. "No one could work effectively like this." A tense silence filled the room. The occupational therapist maintained a neutral expression, accustomed to emotional reactions during the adaptation process. Jessica, who had been discreetly observing from the corner of the room, stepped forward. "Dr. Reynolds, may I give a demonstration?" she asked calmly. Still breathing heavily, he nodded and stepped away from the table. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. With fluid movements that disguised years of practice, Jessica prepared the syringe perfectly, using adapted techniques she had developed over time. "I'm not suggesting it's easy," she said, finishing the demonstration. "It took me months to develop this specific technique. What I'm showing you is that it's possible. And possible doesn't mean inferior." Michael observed the flawless result of her work, and something in his expression shifted subtly. "How do you not give up?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost vulnerable. The frustration, the constant struggle with the simplest things. Jessica considered the question for a moment. "Giving up was never an option," she replied simply. "When you lose a part of yourself, you have two choices: to define yourself by the loss or to redefine yourself in spite of it. I chose the second." The rest of the afternoon passed in a more reflective silence. Michael seemed to be processing not just the physical experience, but something deeper, more fundamental about his own perceptions and biases. When planning for the week, he was surprisingly receptive to Jessica's suggestions, asking genuine questions about accommodations and adaptations for different procedures. It was a small but meaningful start. The following days established a challenging yet gradually more collaborative routine. Michael wore the simulation prosthetics for increasingly longer periods, familiarizing himself with the limitations, but also discovering unexpected possibilities. Jessica, in turn, generously shared her knowledge, never condescending, always with the pragmatism of someone who intimately understood the value of practical solutions. By the middle of the second week, an incident occurred that would mark a turning point in the experience. The new pediatric wing received its first critical patient, Ethan, a 7-year-old boy with cerebral palsy, admitted with severe pneumonia. His condition deteriorated rapidly overnight, requiring immediate intervention. Michael was called in urgently. It was his day to wear the simulation prosthetics, but faced with the emergency, his first instinct was to remove them. "Dr. Reynolds, what are you doing?" Jessica asked as she entered the emergency room and saw him trying to release the prosthetic locks. "I can't risk a patient's life because of an experiment," he replied, frustrated with the complex removal mechanism. Jessica stepped closer, her expression serious but calm. "If I can save lives with real prosthetics, you certainly can do the same with simulators," she said firmly. "Unless you believe my prosthetics make me fundamentally incapable, despite all evidence to the contrary." The challenge hung in the air between them, crystal clear and unavoidable. It wasn't just about that moment or that patient. It was about the very foundation of prejudice Michael had shown in the previous months. Something in Jessica's gaze, not accusatory but unwavering in its truth, struck him in a way no argument ever could. "Let's get to work," he finally said, abandoning his attempt to remove the prosthetics and turning his attention back to the young patient. What followed was a synchronized dance of complementary skills. Michael, limited by the simulated prosthetics, was forced to verbalize his instructions clearly, to rely on the team like never before. Jessica anticipated his needs, translating intentions into actions with remarkable efficiency. When they finally stabilized the boy after nearly 2 hours of intense effort, something different lingered in the air, a shared understanding that went beyond words. "Thank you," Michael said simply as they watched Ethan's stable vitals on the monitor. "We work well together," Jessica replied, a small smile on her lips. In the days that followed, the dynamic between them continued to evolve. Michael showed growing curiosity about the adaptations Jessica had developed over the years. He asked questions, not the condescending ones from before, but genuine inquiries from a doctor eager to learn. "How do you handle the lack of tactile sensitivity in procedures that require pressure perception?" he asked during a break between consultations. Jessica explained how she had developed visual and auditory compensations using alternative indicators to guide her movements where traditional touch wasn't available. "It's like learning a new language," she said. "At first, you're constantly translating in your head. Over time, you start thinking directly in that language." Michael nodded. Thoughtfully, "I never considered it that way. I always saw it as a disability to overcome, not a different way of understanding the body and medicine." For the first time, there was no condescension in his words, just the genuine humility of someone re-evaluating deeply ingrained beliefs. By the 3rd week of the experiment, with the new pediatric wing fully operational and receiving more patients each day, the inclusive protocols Jessica had developed began showing tangible results. Children with different disabilities found not just a physically accessible environment, but an emotionally welcoming one. Jessica's presence, with her visible prosthetics and quiet confidence, had a profound impact, especially on the older children. For many, it was the first time they had seen someone like them in a position of authority and competence. "Look, she has robot arms like me," exclaimed Timmy, a 6-year-old boy with partial prosthetics on both arms when he first saw Jessica. The innocent remark brought smiles to the team, but it was Michael's response that surprised everyone. "Yes, Timmy. And you know what? Nurse, Jessica is one of the most skilled professionals in this hospital. Those special arms give her superpowers that we with regular arms don't have." The boy stared at the doctor with wide-eyed admiration, then at Jessica, and back at his own prosthetics with newfound pride. That small, seemingly trivial moment meant more to Jessica than any formal recognition ever could. The doctor who once saw only limitations in her prosthetics was now presenting them to a child as a source of special abilities. As the 30-day experimental period drew to a close, the transformation in Michael became increasingly evident. It wasn't just his growing skill with the simulator prosthetics, though the progress was remarkable, but a more fundamental shift in his approach to medicine and patients. Where there had once been rigidity and authoritarianism, a new willingness to listen and consider alternative perspectives emerged. His technical excellence, which had always been undeniable, was now complemented by a humanity many hadn't realized he possessed. On the morning of the 25th day, however, an unexpected incident tested the depth of this transformation. During preparations for a relatively simple procedure, inserting a central venous line in a teenage girl with osteogenesis imperfecta, Michael struggled significantly with the simulator prosthetics. After 3 failed attempts, with the patient visibly anxious and uncomfortable, he paused, taking a deep breath to steady his frustration. "I'm removing the prosthetics for this procedure," he declared, beginning to unfasten the locks. Jessica, who was supervising the procedure per protocol, felt her chest tighten. It was a regression to his old pattern, when faced with a challenge, abandoning adaptation for the comfort of familiarity. "Dr. Reynolds," she began, but he interrupted. "This isn't about me, Jessica," he said, using her first name for the first time. "It's about the patient. She's already frightened, and my struggles are only adding to her distress unnecessarily." It was a reasonable argument, clinically sound. But Jessica saw an important teaching moment. "Emily," she addressed the teenager, "would you mind if I explained a little about what we're doing here, about why Dr. Reynolds is wearing these prosthetics?" The girl, still tense but curious, nodded. Jessica then shared in simple but honest terms the purpose of the experiment, how the doctor was voluntarily experiencing limitations similar to those she, Jessica, lived with daily to better understand and improve care for patients with different needs. "It's like when you had to learn to do things differently because of your bones," she explained gently. "Dr. Reynolds is learning too, and sometimes learning is hard and frustrating." The teenager studied the doctor with new understanding. "You can try again," she said bravely. "I don't mind if it takes a little longer." Michael looked at the girl, then at Jessica, a complex emotion crossing his face. Without a word, he readjusted the simulator prosthetics and prepared for another attempt. "I'll guide you," Jessica offered. "We'll do it together." With precise instructions and hands-on support, Michael finally succeeded in completing the procedure, though it took nearly twice the usual time. When he finished, there was a glimmer of genuine satisfaction in his eyes that went beyond mere relief. "Thank you," he told the patient, "for your patience and courage. We're experts in patience, those of us with different bodies," the teenager replied with wisdom beyond her years. That moment left a profound mark on Michael. For the first time, he viscerally understood that the medicine he practiced wasn't just about technically perfect procedures, it was about shared human journeys. The night before the 30th day, the experiment's official end, Michael stayed at the hospital long past his usual hours, reviewing charts in the doctor's lounge. Jessica, finishing an administrative report, was surprised to find him still there close to 10 p.m. "Dr. Reynolds, I didn't expect to see you here so late." He looked up from the documents, weariness evident on his face. "I'm compiling data for tomorrow's presentation to the board," he explained. "The final evaluation of the experiment." Jessica nodded, understanding the importance of that moment. "Can I help in any way?" Michael hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Actually, I'd like your perspective on something." Jessica sat down, intrigued. It was the first time he had explicitly asked for her opinion outside of a strictly clinical context. "I'm trying to articulate what I've learned these past weeks," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "Not just about the practical adaptations, but about myself." He paused, visibly uncomfortable with the vulnerability of the moment. "I started this process, not by choice, as you know. I saw it as a kind of punishment, an unnecessary humiliation." Jessica remained silent, allowing him to find his own way with his words. "What I didn't expect was to discover just how limited my perspective was, not just about you, but about medicine, about ability, about humanity." His gaze finally met hers, surprisingly open. "How did you manage not to hate me? After everything I did, the humiliations, the sabotage, how did you maintain that integrity?" The question caught Jessica off guard. It was deeply personal, revealing a genuine reflection she hadn't anticipated. "I had many moments of anger," she admitted honestly. "Moments when I wanted to give up or retaliate or just scream in frustration." Her metallic fingers tapped softly on the table, an unconscious gesture that had become part of her way of expressing herself. "But I learned early on that hatred is a luxury people like me can't afford. It takes too much energy we need for the constant adaptation our lives demand. And in the end, what I really wanted wasn't to defeat you or humiliate you. It was simply to be seen, truly seen for who I am, not for the parts I'm missing." Michael absorbed her words in silence, something visibly shifting in his understanding. "I think that's what I'll say tomorrow," he finally said, "that I learned to see, not just with the eyes of a doctor, but with the eyes of one human recognizing another in their entirety." The next morning, the boardroom was unusually full for the final presentation of the experiment. In addition to the usual members of the administration, representatives from the American Association of Healthcare Professionals with Disabilities were present, along with medical journalists and even some specially invited patients, including Old George, leaning on his cane watching everything with attentive eyes. Michael and Jessica sat side by side at the main table. He was still wearing the simulation prosthetics, even though he knew this would officially be his last day with them. It was a symbolic but meaningful gesture. The administrative director opened the session with the usual formalities, summarizing the context and objectives of the 30-day experiment. When he finished, he gave Michael the floor. The doctor stood carefully, still adjusting to the limitations of the prosthetics, even after a month of use. He positioned himself before the audience, took a deep breath, and began speaking without referring to the notes he had meticulously prepared. Exactly 30 days ago, I walked into this same hospital as a completely different man, he began, his voice calm but carrying restrained emotion. A technically competent doctor, I never doubted that. But a human being profoundly limited in my understanding of what it means to care, what it means to heal. He paused, his eyes scanning the attentive faces. I believed, like many of us, that disability is essentially an absence, a flaw, something to be corrected or, if impossible, circumvented, something that makes a person fundamentally less capable. His eyes briefly met Jessica's before he continued. What I discovered in these 30 days was exactly the opposite. I found that disability isn't a subtraction, but a multiplication of perspectives, of creative solutions, of ways to understand the human body and the world. He raised his arms with the simulator prosthetics, a gesture he now performed with a naturalness that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. These prosthetics didn't make me less of a doctor, he went on. They made me more human. They forced me to listen when before I only spoke, to collaborate when before I only gave orders, to recognize limitations that aren't in the prosthetics but in the system we designed, assuming one type of body as the standard. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, not with the imposing authority of before, but with the passionate conviction of someone who has witnessed a truth firsthand. I've learned more about medicine in the last 30 days than in many years of practice. Not about procedures or diagnoses, but about the true core of what it means to heal. The ability to see the whole human being before us, not just the body we need to fix. Michael then turned directly to Jessica, his expression revealing something unprecedented, genuine respect, free of condescension or obligation. And for this lesson, I owe thanks to Nurse Jessica Thompson. Her technical skill is unquestionable, as she has demonstrated repeatedly. But her true gift, the one that will remain as a legacy at Mount Sinai University Hospital long after this experiment, is her ability to turn limitations into possibilities, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. The room fell completely, silent as Michael concluded. I formally propose that the Inclusive Protocols project developed by Nurse Thompson be adopted not only in the pediatric wing, but as an institutional guideline for the entire hospital. Furthermore, I propose that Mount Sinai establish a permanent awareness program for all staff, modeled after what I've experienced these past weeks. The applause that followed was spontaneous and prolonged. Jessica, usually reserved with her emotions, felt silent tears roll down her face. They weren't tears of triumph over an adversary, but of recognition, the profound relief of being truly seen. The visibly moved administrative director approached the microphone as the applause died down. I believe I speak for the entire board when I say Dr. Reynolds' proposal is unanimously approved, he declared. Additionally, I'd like to officially announce the creation of the Center for Inclusive Medicine Studies at Mount Sinai University Hospital, under the joint leadership of Dr. Michael Reynolds and Nurse Jessica Thompson. A fresh wave of applause filled the room. Michael, still standing, extended his prosthetic hand to Jessica, who rose and accepted the gesture, their prosthetics, meeting in a clasp that symbolized not just reconciliation, but a new kind of partnership. The following weeks brought swift and significant changes to Mount Sinai. The Center for Inclusive Medicine Studies quickly gained national recognition, attracting professionals from across the country eager to replicate the experience. The simulator, Prosthetics, initially used only by Michael, became part of standard training for residents and new staff. Most importantly, however, was the shift in institutional culture. Where there had once been condescending tolerance toward professionals and patients with disabilities, there was now genuine recognition of different abilities and contributions. Michael and Jessica developed a complementary and efficient working dynamic. His exceptional technical skills combined with her lived experience and natural empathy created a holistic approach that deeply benefited patients, especially the children in the pediatric wing. 6 months after the experiment began, an unexpected event would definitively solidify the transformation started during those challenging 30 days. Ethan, the boy with cerebral palsy, who had been one of the first patients in the new wing, returned to the hospital for a follow-up appointment. Accompanying him was his father, a man with a weary appearance but a determined gaze. Dr. Reynolds, Nurse Thompson, he greeted after the appointment. "I'd like to speak with you both, if possible." In the privacy of the office, the man explained his situation. He was an inventor, specializing in low-cost assistive technologies. Inspired by the treatment his son had received and Jessica's prosthetics, he had developed a prototype adaptive device specifically for children with cerebral palsy. "It's a simple thing, but it could make a big difference in their independence," he explained, showing the technical drawings. "The problem is, I don't have the resources for the necessary clinical trials or the medical connections to validate the project." Michael and Jessica exchanged glances, a silent communication that had developed between them over months of working together. "The Center for Inclusive Medicine Studies could provide the framework for these trials," Michael suggested, carefully. "Examining the drawings, it's exactly the kind of innovation we aim to support. And I know several patients who could benefit immediately," Jessica added. "We could develop a specific evaluation protocol to document the results." The man's face lit up with renewed hope. "You'd do that? Even with no guarantees it'll work or bring financial returns?" Michael smiled, a genuine smile that had become more frequent in recent months. 6 months ago, I probably would have refused, worried about success statistics and return on investment, he admitted honestly. "But I've learned that the most meaningful medicine happens precisely at these unlikely intersections, when we're willing to explore possibilities others overlook." This unexpected collaboration flourished in the following months, with the device being refined through testing cycles and feedback involving the child users directly. The innovative approach, combining Michael's scientific rigor, Jessica's lived experience, and the inventor's creativity, produced results that surpassed even the most optimistic expectations. A year after the prosthetic simulation experiment began, Mount Sinai University Hospital hosted the first American symposium on inclusive medicine, bringing together healthcare professionals, patients, designers, and assistive technology developers from across the country. At the opening ceremony, before a packed auditorium, Michael and Jessica shared the stage, each representing their unique journey to that moment. "When I started using metal prosthetics at 9 years old, I never imagined they'd one day be at the center of my professional identity," Jessica shared. "I spent years trying to hide them, minimize them, compensate for what I saw as a defining disability." She raised her prosthetics, which now gleamed with a custom metallic blue finish, a conscious aesthetic choice reflecting her growing acceptance and even celebration of this part of herself. "Today I understand that my prosthetics aren't just tools replacing what I've lost. They're extensions of who I am, sources of unique perspectives that enrich my practice and benefit my patients." When it was Michael's turn to speak, he began with an admission that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. "My medical training was built on the myth of perfection," he acknowledged, "the idea that there's a standard, functional body, and that anything deviating from that norm represents a flaw to be corrected. This perspective colored not just my medical practice, but my worldview, my relationships, my understanding of human worth." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the diverse audience, which included people with various disabilities. "The simulated prosthetics experiment was initially presented to me as a form of penance," he continued, with the honesty that had become his trademark in recent months. I accepted because I saw no alternative. But what began as embarrassment became the most profoundly educational experience of my career and my life. His voice grew more intense as he concluded, "They say the best doctors are those who know their own limits. What I discovered is that knowing my limits, experiencing them firsthand not just as an abstract concept, made me not just a better physician, but a more complete human being. And that, I believe, is the true healing we all seek." The symposium unfolded over 3 days of passionate discussions, shared experiences, and the development of new protocols. At its conclusion, the creation of a national network of inclusive medicine centers was announced, inspired by the model at Mount Sinai University Hospital. In a private conversation after the event, Jessica found Michael in the new pediatric wing, quietly watching children play in the specially adapted recreation area. "An incredible year, wasn't it?" she remarked, walking up to him. He nodded, a thoughtful smile on his face. "If someone had told me back at that first meeting where I questioned your hiring that we'd be here..." He left the sentence unfinished, shaking his head in disbelief. "Life takes unexpected turns," Jessica replied, "especially when we're forced off our usual paths." "You know what amazes me most?" he asked, watching a little girl with prosthetics similar to Jessica's trying to stack colorful blocks. "It's not just that you overcame physical limitations, it's that you overcame the bitterness I surely would have harbored in your place." Jessica reflected for a moment. "Perhaps because I realized early that our true limitations are rarely physical," she answered. "Prejudice, fear, resistance to change, those are the real obstacles, both for those who direct them at others and for those who internalize them." Michael nodded slowly, absorbing the depth of that truth. "What's next for us?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "After transforming an entire hospital, creating a research center, and launching a national movement, what more can we do?" Jessica smiled, her eyes alight with possibilities. "I think we've only scratched the surface," she replied. "There's an entire healthcare system waiting to be transformed. Hospitals, clinics, medical and nursing schools, still training professionals under the old paradigm of the standard body." Michael finished the thought, and thousands of people with different bodies and abilities, waiting for their unique capacities to be recognized, not just as patients to be treated, but as active participants in their own health. In that moment of shared understanding, they both recognized that the journey that had begun with conflict had grown into something far greater than themselves, a movement with the potential to fundamentally redefine the meaning of healthcare. And it had all started with a simple challenge: to see the world through another's eyes and hands. End of the story. Dear listener, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments what you would do in Jessica's place. Your opinion is very important to help us keep bringing stories that move and transform lives like this one. Thank you for your company.